It's not quite clear how all these things are mixed up together, but somehow no one's talking about wheelchair users anymore, and we're all talking about neurodiversity
Right.
and trans identities. What's gone on there?
I'm smiling because this is the bit that's going to get me cancelled, isn't it? But I'll go ahead. I'm willing to talk about this, and we need to be willing to talk about this. Okay.
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working.
Hi, everybody. I'm here today with George Fielding, who's a campaigner and advocate for people with disabilities. For the last 15 years, George has worked across charities and civil society with a primary focus on young people, starting off at WizKids from age 14. He's a public speaker. He's kind of done the lived experience circuit, although as you'll hear, he's got mixed feelings about that now. He's a 29-year-old wheelchair user. He's in full-time employment, currently in a policy role for a national volunteering charity. Hi, George. Did I get that right?
You did indeed. Tanya, it's fantastic to be with you. Critical podcast, critical issues. Can't wait for this conversation.
Oh, well, thank you for joining. So listen, as someone working on the fringes of DEI and HR for the last 15 years, I actually feel a bit embarrassed to have this conversation with you. I feel like I'm not sure we've made as much progress as I wish that we had on disability. I think the enthusiasm is there, but I think the practical application of that enthusiasm has not been there. So I'm really keen to get into that with you. And I mean, you and I know each other pretty well, which I think is a good starting point for this, because it means we can have a really frank conversation, and I'm not nervous about talking about these issues. And thank you so much for being so open as well,
of course,
and so frank and entertaining as you always are. I know you don't really have another mode. You're like me. We don't really have another mode.
Well, absolutely. We're just going to be the people we are. Have an incredibly honest and we've got to just tackle the complexities here. So absolutely. No problem.
There's lots of employment issues we can talk about to do with people with disabilities, recruitment and all that kind of stuff. But I think what you really bring is that kind of zoomed out approach and almost a sort of philosophical lens looking at this issue. What do you think gives you, I guess, a unique perspective to comment on where you think we are right now in terms of the crossover between disability and the workplace?
Well, I'm going to, if I may, start with. I know it's another loaded word in these circuits, but I'm going to start with joy. I have the best life ever, and I'm incredibly lucky to have the best life that I do. But that is both a symptom of circumstance, but also how this is how I've always been. I have always had cerebral palsy. My life it hasn't changed. I have always had to change and adapt to different environments and make the best of every situation and every environment that I'm ever in. But disability is not a synonym for loss of function, loss of ability. It is just a part of my identity, and one I'm incredibly proud of. The second thing for me to say there is that I'm a wheelchair user, so there's very often little I have to explain. I go into a room and people know what the problem is. I can't walk and never have been able to. So, it's so there is another loaded word, but there's a certain level of privilege here. I live the life that I've always wanted to live, and actually there's very few questions around kind of what my problem or prognosis is. I'll live a long, happy life, but I'll always have cerebral palsy. And that's not always the case in the disabled community.
Okay, let's get into talking about DEI. It's a huge topic. Yeah. DEI, I think, you follow my work closely enough to know that I think we're in a bit of a crisis with DEI. And those of us who've been working in or adjacent to DEI need to do some self-reflection and some soul searching on why and where things have gone so wrong and how to correct them. I know you're not mad about the idea of like the disabled community as an idea. If there was such a thing, how would you characterize how they would feel as a group about whether they've been somewhat ignored in the DEI conversation? Are they grumpy about it? Is it something people are talking about? Do they feel they've been overlooked in favour of kind of sexier causes?
I think they have been ignored, and if they don't feel like they've been ignored, they should feel like they've been ignored because they have been. There's a problem here, which I'll try and kind of step by step kind of articulate to you, because I think of all the difficulties, the long-term investment that's required, the inability within society to acknowledge the human fragility that disability requires, and the fact therefore there's a nervousness and a embarrassment about discussing disability within organisations. It's something that they want to put off, and so it's difficult to do. It's not fashionable. It's much easier to host awareness days and parties for Pride and other things. That then creates a siloed industry. Trainers, influencers, and so there's now this lived experience industry whereby actually there's a lot of people with disabilities that think their only route to work is by getting up every single day and talking about and broadcasting to the world, either in organisations or online, the thing that makes them, in terms of society or how society views them, weaker than other people. And you can be on that circuit and you can say incredibly wonderful lines and get your applause and standing ovations, and people tell you you're inspirational, and all of these things. But those words are not going to lead to action unless there are people within society and within systems that can actually drive the change that's required.
You and I quite often exchange notes about people who we see doing this on LinkedIn, the sort of lived experience experts who come in and they kind of sell. It's not always terribly clear advice. It's quite often based on themselves and their own sort of story. It's their personal brand. Their personal brand is kind of all they have in a way. And it seems to be people who maybe had a job. They tend to be quite young. I'd say most of them are under 35, many of them are under 30, who haven't really integrated properly into the workforce. They haven't really had a proper job for that long. I've been worried that I think some of the messaging that's coming across isn't quite right. And I'm also a bit worried that they kind of get into their comfort zone doing this, creating their own sort of bubble, especially if they're popular. And I'm not really seeing, I guess, from my kind of graduate careers advice hat on, which is my former life, I don't really see that they're getting any real career progression, any skills development, any mentoring. No. So I'm worried for the people that they're talking to. And I'm also worried about them themselves and whether this is really working, or whether this is becoming a slightly unhealthy kind of phenomenon that we need to look at again. What are your thoughts?
I'm phenomenally worried, Tanya. That would be the easiest career for me to walk into, and I'm not going to do it. So, and I won't do it for these reasons. I genuinely worry that actually these employers don't do any due diligence on these lived experience trainers, because and so there's an idea that because they don't know how to tackle disability, because it's a complex issue, they'll just outsource a day's training at a certain rate to a lived experience consultant. Do these lived experience consultants know the Equality Act? What training do they have? These are that's one question I have. The other question I have is that I actually think it's incredibly unfair. It's incredibly unfair to expect somebody who is often very young, who hasn't got much experience in the workplace, as you say, Tanya, to broadcast their life and broadcast their vulnerability and their anxiety or what have you upon the world, and to make that their only route to business. I think it's psychologically damaging, and I don't think it's good for the long term, because if you've spent 5 years telling employers on LinkedIn and other social media sites that exactly why workplaces are not accessible and why you find work difficult, the moment that you actually need to find a job, you've actually got a really detailed public track record of a lot of things that you need to defend, and I worry that these lived experience influencers are in the short term or in the long term, making their route to employment more difficult. I also think it's having a very superficial impact on audiences, and people are just scrolling at night, getting the likes, and there is a difference between neurodiversity and disability we can't go around broadcasting illnesses and conditions to the wider world and judging our impact by the number of likes that we have. I think it's very superficial. I think I think that if predominantly the people that are sucking up this content creation are young, are very conscious of always being kind and being tolerant of their friends and their colleagues, then I think what you're doing is you're having a very, as I say, superficial and dangerous impact upon kind of what is a very impressionable young audience half the time, and creating change within EDI is a much more complex business.
We sometimes exchange messages about some of the LinkedIn influencers that we see, who seem to be very invested in this idea of promoting themselves as kind of helpless victims who have this very long list of demands for accommodations, which seem to prioritize comfort always over kind of stretching beyond what might be comfortable. And I think you're right to be concerned about what message that's sending about people with disabilities overall. This one person with a very loud voice, with a very big platform, is telling employers to see everybody with a disability or who might be neurodivergent as in this way, this person that needs all these, that has all these demands, that is going to be endlessly, frankly, quite demanding in the workplace. It's like, is that how we want to be selling this? Or do we want to be saying, here's the list of things that would really help me to do a great job. There's a few things on it, but it's not that long, and these are all quite doable. Like, is it sending a message to employers that's actually a bit off-putting because the list is so long?
Absolutely, and I think it's having damaging effects. But let me first say, we all need to be very, very careful about the feedback loop. About the importance of what we say and what we hear ourselves say. If all these people are saying, oh, I'm having this difficulty today, or this is the weakness, this is the deficit, this is the challenge, that is not aspirational. That's not going to change anything, and I do think, being in a room with an influencer like that, or believing that is the nature of what the workforce is going to be like, it's going to be very off-putting for employers. But let's not kind of joke about this, because it is having immeasurable effects upon the NHS, upon access to work, which is a DWP scheme that people are now applying more and more for accommodations and reasonable adjustments because of anxiety, because of conditions or symptoms connected to neurodiversity. And so these, a new trend is that anxiety and other things are underpinning what are now being asked for as reasonable adjustments in the workplace. And as far as when I started this 15 years ago, that wasn't true. That's a new phenomenon, a new trend, and if I may say so, those symptoms are best treated by therapists and clinically trained professionals, rather than necessarily your manager in your workplace. And I think that might be unfair. But if there has been an upsurge in a number of employees asking for adaptations like that, then what they're doing is encroaching upon the people that need the lifts and the ramps and all of these things that actually have a physical disability that is long term. and as I say, those things that would have a much more structural societal benefit to society.
It seems from what lots of employers say is that people that most need the adjustments are the people that are least likely to speak up. And
Yes.
I do worry about all the oxygen being sucked up by groups who, with some need but less need, but just louder voices, frankly, and the people that actually need the support not getting it because they still feel much more private about their additional needs. And we still haven't really addressed why they're not speaking up, and it's because of all the usual stuff which we know about shame and not wanting to be seen as being difficult and a problem.
And they're scared of the confrontation. I have to say that an underpinning kind of raison d'etre behind this influencer industry, and actually EDI in general, is be kind. No debate, be kind. And I don't know anyone who hasn't been kind to me and doesn't want to be kind in conversation. But if that's what underpins every conversation we have around EDI and disability, we won't actually have the debate and the conversation we need to have, because there's going to be disagreement and there's going to be different routes to actually success on these matters. But I think so. We're in this kind of echo chamber of kind of superficial conversations where all we do is be kind and nod as if and affirm their difficulty rather than solving the problem or prioritizing other people over others.
And do you think that be kind has, I think initially anyway, I think it might be changing actually, meant for employers that they felt they should just kind of acquiesce to whatever the demands are, whatever the requests are, until it's got crazier and crazier, and then they're like, hang on a minute, this is just getting too much. We can't give all these people all this help.
Absolutely.
But I think that's what kindness looked like. And then I don't think enough thought was given to, well, if we're kind to this group, there might be another group who are missing out. Even if we're throwing a lot of budget at this group and no budget at this group, be kind, tended to be kind to the loudest group, which I think has become a bit of an issue. So do you feel that people with disabilities, more kind of, I don't know whether you'd call more like traditional disabilities, like being a wheelchair user or having some kind of sensory, disability, like being deaf or not having brilliant eyesight or whatever. Do you think that has been kind of crowded out by neurodiversity? And also I've noticed that trans identity has also come into the conversation a lot. And it's not quite clear how all these things are mixed up together, but somehow no one's talking about wheelchair users anymore, and we're all talking about neurodiversity and trans identities. What's gone on there?
I'm smiling because this is the bit that's going to get me cancelled, isn't it? But I'll go ahead. I'm willing to talk about this, and we need to be willing to talk about this. Okay, so yes, I believe that you're right. You're right that neurodiversity, that trans identity, that all of these things have I think with good intention originally, but they've taken up the oxygen now from disabilities. Statistics have been circulating that I think by Scope, I saw them say that 1 in 3 people with disabilities identify as LGBT. I personally don't believe that statistic. Because there's absolutely no reason why a person with a disability is more likely to be LGBTQ than the others than the other parts of the population. So we need to do a lot more.
You don't believe that you do believe that they identify as that, but you don't believe that they are that, or you've got questions around why that would be so overrepresented in that group.
Yes. Let's say I have questions, and I'll go one step further, or maybe 2. And I shouldn't perhaps use the word steps as a wheelchair user, but we can come back to that as well. But I'll go 2-3 steps.
I'm not offended if you're not offended.
No, I'm not offended. I won't be offended. But the point, the point being that, especially around the trans identity stuff, okay, we are dreadfully, dreadfully bad at sex and relationship education in Britain. Okay, for all of us, but we are dreadfully bad at, even worse, at developing, take some relationship education for those that have a specialist need in terms of people with disabilities. And so there isn't a person that I know that didn't find puberty difficult. Bodies change, and this is it's messy, it's difficult. But it's also the most natural human process and instinct. But we haven't been having that conversation with people with disabilities. May I say that the man that cured solved the Enigma code was sterilised for being gay about and autistic in the 1940s. I still, as a wheelchair user who's now 29, clinging on to my 20s, I don't know many people with disabilities who are parents. And there's this historical dichotomy or spectrum that you are that as a wheelchair user you're either an angel or you're a sinner. You're either an angel and therefore you would never drink, you would never have sex, you would never do any of these things that is societally uncomfortable, because you're an angel and you have wings and you're pure, or you're a sinner because you're committing, and this has religious connotations, if I don't mind saying. You're a sinner because you sinned in the previous life, and therefore the disability is the price that you pay for what have both of these things. I'm happy to say right now are absolute rubbish, but I think that they are having dangerous consequences with regard to this debate. Right?
Do you think that it's possible that what employers are looking at in this crossover is a group who have got their own personal stuff going on, which they want to talk about sexuality and desire and things like that? There isn't really a space for them to do that, but somehow the LGBT community within their workplace sometimes is the place that ends up being the only place they feel they can talk about this stuff, and it's kind of fun, and there's instant acceptance and camaraderie and that kind of stuff. And there's also, I mean, you see if you sit in on these groups, it seems to me that neurodiversity is overrepresented as well within these groups. Disability is kind of thrown in as well into the mix, which is why I think there's so little space for disabilities, because it's kind of thrown in with all those conversations. And I think there's already enough going on in those rooms, which, like you, I've got questions about what's going on there as well, and whether we've got our approach to this right yet. And I don't think we have. No. But the sort of disability ends up losing out.
It's being conflated with everything else. As I'm saying, if we do not facilitate at a very young age the natural, healthy conversation about attraction, about the fact that puberty is a process that everybody, whether you're disabled or not, goes through, and we are silencing or not providing that support to the disabled community because historically we think they're angels and therefore won't be able to have relationships. Then they are going to have questions. But
why is that turning up in the workplace? I mean, that seems
well. Why is it?
There's nowhere else. There's no other space for them to have that conversation.
No. There is no other space for them to have that conversation. And within EDI, you have special interest groups. You have you have these affinity groups, and therefore they find their crowd and their community, and within the workplace and elsewhere, these things are natural. Then to want a community, to want to explain what's going on in your body and who you're attracted to, and to want to have these natural conversations is as I say, it's obvious, but
I'm not sure that's appropriate in the workplace. I don't think the workplace is the right place for that, and I'm not surprised that employers are starting to say, "Oh, hang on a minute. Who's supervising these groups? Are these conversations going in the right direction?" Like all this stuff, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And I'm a little bit worried that employers are a bit of more than they can chew with that. And it's quite difficult now to correct that.
No, it is. And we are going to have to correct it without fear that we're going to be kind of rude or denying someone their identity. And that conversation, believe me, is going to have to be mediated.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick reminder to like and subscribe. It really helps new people to find us. and it means I can keep enticing great guests to join us. If you work in HR and enjoy the podcast and would value speaking to other employers who share an appetite for robust discussion, do get in touch with me via LinkedIn. We'll be launching a new community soon, so this is your chance to shape those plans. Okay, I'll let you go back to the episode. I think one of the other things I'm concerned about within some of the affinity groups or staff networks, whatever that we're calling them within workplaces, is that you're ending up with a sort of co-rumination kind of bubble.
Yes.
And whether that's LGBT or whether it's neurodiversity, a mix of neurodiversity, disability, all these things in the same room, there's a lot of I think possibly quite unhelpful ideas about some of the framing of these conditions and barriers that are not terribly productive either for the people individually or for the organisation itself. And I think there's a lot about sort of late diagnosis of certain conditions, particularly ADHD. There's a lot of talk at the moment about ADHD online diagnoses are suddenly, as far as I understand it, not being recognised by some GPs. So some people are finding that their medication is being stopped, which they've been quite dependent on or have become dependent on. So there's a lot of talk about that. And I don't know whether the workplace is the place to be having these conversations. My instinct is get these conversations out of the workplace. But I think what's happened is workplaces have tried to create spaces for their employees from these different groups to be able to talk to each other. But this is not, suddenly this is feeling like we're out of our depth here. And these are not conversations but they're not supervised. But even if they were supervised, like who would be supervising them? And that feels like group therapy to me, for which you need a proper therapist that knows what they're doing.
Exactly. I worry that it is group therapy. I worry too that it's typical bona fide mission drift. It's
group therapy without a therapist.
It's group therapy without a therapist. I genuinely worry about the trend, the kind of subcontract policy writing and policy sign off around EDI to these groups.
Yes, so do I.
And this is where you're going to get, and you do get, and Tanya, you know much more about this than me, a jarring between EDI and HR, because as far as I've ever understood it is not the objective of EDI to sign off on organisational policy, and HR is governed by employment law, and so you have a contradiction and a difficulty that a lot of these things that a lot of these groups are calling for go beyond employment law, and actually therefore your EDI professionals are often the ones breaking employment law, and that's difficult. So
it's at the very least we're talking about a knowledge gap or some kind of decision making error in that we haven't got the right people in the room, or this hasn't been passed through the lawyers. I agree with you. Have we consulted all the affected parties, and is this really a group? I think we just took everything at face value from all these groups, thinking, well, they know best. One of the things Google talk about is nothing about us without us, which suddenly means you're being led by the people with an awful lot of skin in the game, who are very invested in their own identity, has become very attached to a lot of this stuff. And I think, particularly around things, I sit with sort of late diagnosis of ADHD, a lot of people saying, now I understand, now the whole of my life up to this date now makes sense to me. There's a sort of, almost like a sort of rebirth, which I hear them describing. Then you're asking these same people who are in quite a sort of raw state to somehow feed into company policy, or at least provide their ideas for how things can be better. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure these people are in great shape. I think they're quite early in their learning about accepting themselves and this new information.
So there's so many important factors here that I think are getting conflated up. We do need to recognise that getting a diagnosis is incredibly difficult at this moment in time. Waiting lists for all sorts of things across the NHS are the longest they've ever been. And I don't know if any of your listeners have ever read Kafka, but we have to realise that actually a lot of the time the thing that is traumatizing is the process. So there's a reward, a celebration. The fact you've got to the end, you've got your certificate, you've got your affirmation, and yes, they've gone through a painful process to get there, and it's taken far longer than perhaps it should. But they're carrying this weight around. they're then I think wrongly told by these influencers that their whole life has changed. They're a different person now, and there's a rebirth there, which I think so that connects to the influencers and the kind of superficial liking on LinkedIn and the content we discussed earlier. But it also connects thirdly to this idea of sin, this historical idea that being disabled is something, or having a condition is in some way sinful, and this goes back generations, and therefore there is this idea that I can live a different life now. It all makes sense to me, and I can live as the person I've always wanted to be. The truth is, you've just got a condition. You've not changed, and I hope that certificate kind of does get you the adjustments that you need to live a better life. But you've not changed, Do
you see that late diagnosis? There's some similarities with late diagnosis and late kind of acquisition of a disability.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's psychological. A lot of people have acquired disability. They're great friends of mine and beautiful people. But what they're coming to terms with is loss. The fact that they can't do something that they've done before. With the late diagnosis, there's this idea that society and systems owes them something for making them go through a process or not understanding how they naturally were before. So I deserve this. I deserve this reasonable adjustment as a right now because I've got the certificate, and therefore society and systems did me wrong. On both sides of the spectrum, there are different conversations, but it's a psychological underpinning difficulty that these two conversations are having. And if I may say so, I know it's not directly but this is playing out a lot right now with the assisted dying bill and kind of the terminally ill adults end of life bill that's going through Parliament, because all of the people that want assisted dying to be legalised, they are all speaking from a position of hurt. They've all seen somebody that they love die in pain or without the palliative care they should have had, and they're now in a position where they think the best thing to do as soon as you get a diagnosis that may be terminal is to die, and that has profound complications and difficulties for the disabled community.
I think there's a whole bigger conversation about lived experience and how we manage that. I think lived experience is great as evidence, as, when we're gathering information about how different groups feel about things. Where I think it's gone a bit wrong is when we have very raw lived experience on a decision-making panel, which is making decisions for loads of other people. And that feels to me like that's becoming a dangerous issue. And so I think, this is a dying bill is an example of societal wide thing. But I think, you could shrink the lens down to the workplace and think, actually, someone who's just had an ADHD diagnosis, that might have stirred up all sorts of their own stuff. And are they necessarily the best person to be inputting into policy with something that's very raw for them? It's very painful, very personal. I'm not sure that that's the right way to go for employers.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. And that isn't the conversation for employers to have. But we need to tackle that underlying all of the underlying feelings that have been stirred up by that. But you just don't tackle them in the workplace. And you don't let that bleed into legislation for your organisation or for government.
Yeah. Okay. One of the things that the disability and neurodiversity trainers talk about quite a lot when they come in to talk to organisations is language and what they might see as microaggressions. And so a lot of this policing of language has come in, particularly around disability, I think. I think it's coming around race as well, but disability is probably the big one, I would say. Things like turning a blind eye, falling on deaf ears, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I mean,
too left feet.
too left feet. It's the kind of thing, I think it's the kind of thing that's actually bugging a lot of people in the workplace, because they just feel like a lot of these expressions are just a lot of expressions that have come about because they feel like, we understand what we mean by falling on deaf ears. Like it's sensory stuff particularly is linguistically very helpful for all sorts of reasons. Do you, and I think it's starting to bug people actually that they're being told they're not allowed to use
It's always
these
bugged me. It's always bugged me. I have to say, I must be incredibly foresighted because we're actually having the conversation we should have been having 15 years ago. It's always bugged me. I have never managed my language. I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to go for many walks today. So we laugh about it. We do. But it has incredibly important implications if we control people's language. You can always judge the intent behind the words. There are only 3 words that upset me, right? Cripple, spastic, and retard. Okay. Now, for many reasons, those are historically offensive words. We should never use them, right? But even that, it makes me squirm because when I'm with my disabled friends, I say, "Oh, I'm with my Crips." We've taken it. We've tried to reclaim the word that's offended us. This has a very historical similarity with the reclaiming of queer in the LGBT community, and so I get it. And there's a great history of within disability rights of piss on pity. And all of these things are fabulous and well intended. But I'm never going to say to people that I'm with my Crips, because it's not right. But it has, or doesn't sit well with me, right? I think it blocks progress, right? Because instead of actually dealing with the problems we're arguing over language, it takes longer to address these conversations because you always have to correct people as to what you're actually discussing and what you're trying to change, and because you got. Oh, may I correct you on your language first? I'll never be offended by these words. I've used all of those phrases, and I probably will tomorrow. But the idea that language is the underpinning thing that we have to tackle first is actually what I think blurs and masks what the actual structural problem is for a lot of these communities, because other people are claiming words that aren't theirs or that have different definitions.
I think it also makes people more nervous about people with disabilities, makes people more nervous about including them because they think, oh God, I've got to get the language right.
And then
suddenly you can't be yourself and you can't relax. And you're like, how can I include someone if I'm totally stressed about saying dumb something like, oh, did you walk here, George? And then go, oh God, why did I say that? Of course you didn't walk here. Like,
well, the answer is, Tanya, the answer is yes, I did walk here. Yes, I did. But it's also, if I may say so, just to give your listeners some relief, I hope. There's no legal problem with offence. There might be something I've said in this podcast that offends people, and I'm sorry, I'm not intending to offend, but you can't come at me and say I've done something wrong. The thing that is legally challengeable is kind of persistent evidence of discrimination, and therefore by using the wrong word, you're not going to get yourself in front of a law court. And if you are, it's because somebody has muddled up some sort of weird legal challenge that that shouldn't really be taking up space or oxygen. Because actually, the one thing I find most offensive is the silence. We have to discuss these things. We have to be in spaces where we can discuss these things, and we have to sit in the complexity of EDI, and we have to have these conversations. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen. I am coming at this from a activist lens, and because we have to make life better for people with disabilities. One in 6 of us have a disability, and 1 in 4 people that have a disability live in poverty. The best way to live the circumstances of people with disabilities is to give them a job, give them pay, give them meaning, give them purpose, give them connection, right? And yes, but doing all of these things is difficult, and we're never going to be able to do it. We're never going to be able to do it if we don't have the conversations.
You've actually brought us onto the final part, which is I know we're going to talk in further episodes of different people all about kind of the nuts and bolts of recruitment and employment for people with disabilities. I guess I just wanted to touch on a little bit of some of this, what I've learned, particularly from being friends with you, about what works and doesn't work for you in an employment sense. For example, I mean, I know that you've talked a bit about how, given that we know that 15% of the population has a disability, and it certainly looks, unless all these people have invisible disabilities, it certainly looks like they're not represented in most workplaces that I know of. There's a sense that if you are a person with a disability and you do have a good job, a full-time job, as you do, there's a sense that you feel a sort of inner sense that you should be really grateful for it, and you shouldn't be difficult, and you might not find, as nice people somewhere else. And I'm wondering whether never heard employers talking about, actually, this is a group who are unlikely to ask for a pay rise. If we're really disability friendly, confident, whatever they call themselves, whatever the buzzword is, actually you would be having a special eye on somebody who hasn't asked for a pay rise for ages but is doing brilliant work, and not wait until they start pushing for one because they're less likely to. Do you think that's right, or have I mischaracterized that?
It's certainly right in my circumstance. And I think others as well. I'm going to be totally honest with you, as I always am, and in public. The conversations I have that I find the most difficult are with people with disabilities. The vast majority of people with disabilities would dream of the life that I have. They would dream of the freedom of having my own of their own flat, their own job, their own money. The freedom and the independence that I have, they would dream of. Okay. Therefore, yes, my salary isn't the highest, but every time I look to and have a conversation with somebody with a disability, I think I'm incredibly grateful, right? And I should be incredibly grateful. And that certainly does hold me back. And I can't be. No one person with disability is going to be the person that changes the reason why that's the case. There are so many reasons as to why people with disabilities aren't in the workplace, and it is going to take a long time to fix that. And I feel incredibly grateful too, because I'm in a job that isn't actually dependent upon my own lived experience. So I'm actually 2 steps ahead, or many steps ahead of other people with disabilities in their careers. And I'm in a position where actually my salary is high enough that I don't have to worry about whether or not working full time affects my benefits or not. There's a lot of benefits that are dependent upon you only working a certain number of hours. So it's going to take a cross-societal effort to get a lot of people with disabilities into the workplace. I'm not saying that that is always the responsibility of your employer, but sadly, to be in a position as a disabled person where you can apply for a job, where you have the accreditations and the record and the experience to actually get an interview, it means that you're actually probably in the top 5-10% of people with disabilities in general in society. People with disabilities are 2 times adults with disabilities are 3 times more likely not to be in education, training, or employment as their non-disabled peers. And so I know how unique I am, and therefore that is an internalized pressure, but it's also a pressure that employers shouldn't place upon me, because I can't speak to every experience and every policy that might affect people with disabilities. Because that's a bubble that I'll never get out of. And
you've talked a bit before about how you feel you've kind of got God, these steps and feet metaphors everywhere. You've kind of got a foot in both camps.
Yes.
In terms of like being part of the disabled community and also not.
Yes.
And it's a sort of duality, I suppose, to your life.
Yes, it is. And it's a superpower. Another word that many people will scoff at. But people do not expect me to turn up. They don't expect me to speak with such articulacy. They and power and experience. I have been a leading voice in both youth work, civil society, and social care, and I can and I'm respected in all in all three of those industries. I hope, but so they're not expecting that. Anyone in the room is not expecting it. As I said, that shock is what makes my money. But it is difficult. If I'm in a room with somebody who's younger than me, perhaps, or less experienced with their disability than me, hopefully I am a source of hope for them. But they then can't be dependent upon my example, the people that I gained a lot of inspiration from when I was 10, 15, 18, they're still the only and the loudest voices in the disability rights movement now. People like Liz Card, Tanya Gray Thompson, Ruth Owen, Zara Todd, phenomenal people. But we've not done enough to invest in disability leadership. And
if we had, there'd be a new generation that used.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'm it. I'm it, and I still don't know many. I don't know many others. And that,
do you think that
doesn't mean I'm perfect.
Well, close.
Close.
And also, one of the things I've really learned from being friends with you is how many extra costs you have.
Yeah.
Not only on your time, but also on your actual pocket. So things like you end up getting a lot more Ubers than your average person, because so many of the places that you want to go to aren't accessible. There isn't a tube station nearby that has a lift, for example, and you're running late and it's raining, and so you're going to get an Uber. So that's another 40 quid or whatever.
Yeah.
Also, I didn't realise that you pay for your own wheelchair, which I know it broke when we were first friends, and it was $4,000.
Yes.
And then you had to pay to get it fixed recently. That was another £300 out of pocket to get it fixed. You've got to get to the wheelchair place, which is not in central London.
Exactly.
So you've got to get there, which is also a pain when the wheelchair's not working.
Yeah.
And also little things like buying your lunch every day. You're not great with a sharp knife, frankly. So this is...
I'm not good in the kitchen. Not good in the kitchen.
I'm
not good in the kitchen.
I have many other gifts, but not knife skills. So, you end up buying food out all the time. And we know how expensive everything is right now. And it's like, this is an extra tax on you, which I just feel like this is something that employers need to be aware of, the fact that a lot of their colleagues with disabilities are paying extra money out of the same, frankly, not brilliant salary. I'm not saying about your salary, but whatever you're paying somebody, if you're thinking, oh, well, we do employ someone and we pay them 25 grand or whatever it is. Like, well, yeah, but if they have to pay 4 grand on their wheelchair and that leaves them with 21, like, it's not that much.
So
they're not spending that money on a holiday. They're spending it on a new wheelchair. It's like, there's all these extra costs, and I'm sure there's a million more depending on what the disability is.
Yeah. But the truth is, the disability charity Scope just put out research to say that it costs an extra £1,010 a month for a person with a disability to have the same standard of living as their non-disabled peers. As you say, my wheelchair costs £6,000 and a lot more every time I have to maintain it. It costs more to live as a disabled person.
So if you're concerned about money, I'm not saying you are right now, but if you're in a position where you feel underpaid as a person with a disability, or you're thinking about moving jobs, what's going through your head at that point? What's making you not go for it?
Well, I've never got a job that from a traditional recruitment process. Every job I've ever applied for or been successful at, I've known somebody. I've either set up the company or known somebody who's kind of recommended me forward. It's incredibly burdensome process applying for a job, and there is always this dilemma: do I or don't I kind of announce my disability as part of the process? Do I come out as a person with a disability or not? And it is an underwritten kind of stress for a lot of disabled applicants. What will employers think of me? Will they have the adaptions in place? Will they have the lift? Will they have the money, the time to actually accommodate my reasonable adjustments? If I am the best candidate on merit for the job, are they going to go the extra mile in order to apply me to give me the job, or are they going to just give the job to the person who's most convenient to give the job to, which may not be me?
I'm now beginning to see why there are so few people with disabilities represented at senior levels in organisations, because It's not that the ambition isn't there, as far as what you're saying. It's that there are an awful lot of little nagging voices that will say, oh, here are the reasons not to go for it. Actually, you're probably fine where you are. They're really nice here. You might as well, and like you say, job hunting's horrible for everybody. You're going to get rejected. And you've got an extra factor like that, or maybe it was because I'm a wheelchair user and they couldn't be bothered with the adjustments and all of that. You don't, on top of that, I can see why that's not appealing.
Yeah. And thank you for the therapy here, Tanya, because I now realise of the 3 employers that I've had, two of them were organisations that I set up. And somehow there is, somehow it is easier for somebody like me who's entrepreneurial, who has a disability, who can work full time, to actually just find the funding to solve the problem myself and do it myself and build it up and kind of revel in that kind of startup designer space. It's much easier for me to do that than it is to go through a recruitment process where I don't trust I'm going to get the outcome that I should. And now maybe the fact I don't trust the fact that I'm not going to get the outcome that I should is not a problem, but it's still, it's something I need to be, and employers need to be alive to, I guess.
You're not a huge fan of the access to work scheme, are you? I know that there's going to be. I mean, it doesn't help. It doesn't seem to be working for anybody at the moment. Well, from what I hear, and are they about to make it worse?
They're about to make it worse.
Is that even possible?
Look. I've probably been cancelled twice in this podcast already, so here goes again. I might as well just. There's nothing about access to work that actually does work at this moment in time. Access to work is the funniest term in the history of these things, because you actually need the job before you can apply for the support before you can apply for the support to it through access to work. Then you've got 6 months on average, normally perhaps 8, before they actually review your application. And so you have to get the job, and you have to go through 6 months to 8 months before they even look at your application. So the majority of people have burnt out before they're actually have come down to addressing and discussing your application. And there's a lot of a lot of money, a lot of time goes into access to work. It is, but every time you call them, and I do receive access to work, you're on the phone for 45 minutes and they don't know the answer. So like every portal or process we've ever known, they signpost you elsewhere. So there's the process just takes an incredible amount of time. I didn't receive any support through access to work until more than a year, 18 months after I put in the application process. And let me tell you, if you've actually got a disability that restricts your ability to be productive in work, you're likely not to be in the job that you've been recruited for at the point you apply. Now, there are statistics. I don't know how old these statistics are, but 48,000 employees with disabilities are managed out of work each year. And there's an incredible lack of awareness around it is so difficult to get the support, and whole idea of access to work is that money gets reimbursed, but the initial cost lies with the employer. So you need written in evidence that you're going to get the money back. This is after years of a process that doesn't work anyway. And philosophically, I'm sorry to say, but philosophically, the only way I know normally to live an independent life where I'm free to make my own choices is to avoid these systems, because it is so hard to get the support you need. It is blood sucking. It's like a leech, and therefore it is easier to go without the support than it is to claim the support. And I think there are many people in this community would say it is designed like that. It is designed like that because and so it's very difficult at this moment in time because access to work is under a lot of pressure, and we need a lot of people in work, and we need a lot of people with disabilities to work. Please make it happen. But access to work isn't working, and therefore I would say we do need to ditch it and redesign it. So, but saying that as a disabled person is very difficult right now because it's the only form of support into work that I'm aware of for people with disabilities. Sir Stephen Timms, the Minister for Disabilities, I think he's on it, but it's one hell of a challenge.
Do you think they want to put more responsibility onto employers?
Yes,
which doesn't. Yeah.
And that has pros and cons, but I think for all the reasons
that needs to be carefully managed. That's yes. A whole other podcast, probably. I suspect.
Well, that's where you get Audrey on.
Exactly. Yes. Audrey Ludwig is person to come on. Audrey, if you're listening, you're on next. George, listen, thank you so much. I know you always talk about how the rebellion is in the movement, don't you? I always love that.
Indeed.
And that because you're such a big believer in sort of keep on moving, and anything that feels like stagnation, you're kind of allergic to. Do you have any kind of final words for us? I hope you've enjoyed this conversation.
I have enjoyed this conversation. I want to say first off that this all of the trends that we're speaking about in HR, in EDI, and in identity politics, they are having a very dangerous, I think, and troubling impact upon people with disabilities, and it's complex, it's difficult. And Tanya, you're one of the only commentators that seems to be willing to have conversations like this. I'm hoping to start a conversation here. It's an incredibly important conversation. We've touched on a lot of things that, psychological, social, and otherwise, that are bleeding into the workplace. I'm not saying that any of these things or all of these things are the employer's responsibility, but they are somebody's. And what I can say after 15 years of campaigning on this stuff is that we don't actually have many voices or many people that are actually willing to grasp the problems that people with disabilities are having. It is somebody's problem. It is somebody's problem because the cost and the social cost to us as a society of not tackling them is profound. So I'm incredibly grateful for the work that you do. I'm incredibly grateful for the conversation in it, and I hope people that are listening have learned something.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, George. Thank you.
No problem.